and gentlemen, I'm Steve Chaney. I'm the CEO of the American Security Project, and I'm so disappointed that you're all not glued to your TV watching the confirmation hearing of our founding father, Senator Kerry. But it is a very unusual time for the American Security Project. That Senator Kerry will be confirmed probably next week to the Secretary of State, and then Senator Hagel, who was his co-father of ASP, of course, we hope will get confirmed as Secretary of Defense. So these are big times for the American Security Project. But we were founded to take on topical issues and educate people, you, the press, the Hill, Pentagon, White House, the general public, on issues that were topical but had a national security perspective to them, and that we could bring them up and discuss the facts about these issues, not the least of which was climate security, energy security, nuclear security, terrorism, asymmetric operations were probably all our plank issues. And drones clearly fit into this category as well. We are bipartisan. If you look at our board, in fact, we're going to have more Republicans than Democrats, a number of businessmen and women, along with a number of flag officers from each of the services, 3 and 4 stars, who we think gives us the credibility on the national security side. So that's going to bring me to talk about drones for a minute, but let me talk some ground rules here for a second. I'm going to introduce Josh. Josh is going to talk for just a second, then he'll introduce our panelists. When they all get done, we'll go to a Q&A. The Q&A is I like to run it, and this is a small room. We don't have a roving mic. What I'll ask you to do, if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll recognize you. Stand up. Please state your name and your affiliation, and hopefully a short question. And I'll probably ask you to speak up pretty loudly. And we should have, I think, probably 30 or so minutes of Q&A. Given this topic, I'm sure you've got a lot of questions. Many know I'm a retired Marine, and I flew a number of years in an aircraft that was particularly vulnerable on reconnaissance missions. And I'm so happy that there are drones up there doing the job that I was doing 25 years ago. Much rather have a drone doing what a person would have been doing and not threaten that person and have him or her vulnerable up in the sky. But it's never that easy, as you would all know, and there are a lot of strategic and implications with drones. Drones are not the answer to everything in our Department of Defense, and Senator Kerry so said this morning in his hearing. There's some legal implications here that we think ought to deserve the light of the day when you look at them and find out what are the questions, how are we using them, who's being targeted, and I think we're going to cover a little bit of all of that stuff here this afternoon. So with that, let me turn it over to Josh Faust, who's our fellow for asymmetric operations and terrorism. Josh.
Thanks, Steve. So people really love talking about drones these days. It's kind of buzzy, I guess is the right word for it. But to different degrees, we've been looking at this going back a little over a year now, and it's tied in with kind of our broader research objectives in terms of looking at the long-term strategic interests of the country and whether or not we're actually achieving them. Part of this has taken the form of analyzing the war in Afghanistan. And I think as that war has wound down, and both the Defense Department and the counterterrorism community have broadened their scope, and in some ways broadened their use of force to other places, our research has followed suit and also looked at other ways that we're employing violence around the world, other ways that we're trying to both address terrorism, manage it to a certain extent, or prevent it if humanly possible. I think that kind of organically leads into studying drones and in reality, the larger policy of targeted killings. As anyone who's in the military will tell you, drones are not the only ones going out and killing bad guys, including in places like Yemen or elsewhere. There are also aircraft that do this, there are artillery that do this, there are special forces, in some cases special operations forces, I should say, who do this as well. And so it's this broad policy of how we're actually conceiving of both the challenge that terrorism is posing to the country, and then also what the best way is of addressing that challenge. Whether over the long run we are improving our status and our stakes in the conflict, whether they're staying the same, whether they're getting worse. The report that we're launching today about trying to understand some of the strategic and tactical considerations around drone strikes is kind of a first stab at trying to answer that. So what I do in the report is try to lay out 10 broad metrics. There are a lot more that we can be looking at, but I was trying to keep this at a fairly high level at two different levels of analysis. So both the immediate consequences of who's being targeted, what effects we can actually measure, and whether or not we are actually addressing the immediate challenge that these drone strikes are supposed to solve. And then also trying to look at it over time. So these groups that we're targeting, whether they're growing or shrinking, whether they're having more success in recruitment or less success, whether they're becoming more active or not, whether official statements about the threat are changing over time, and if so, how. And the end result of a lot of this is, in a way, kind of a common sense declaration, which is that tactically these make a lot of sense. As my boss was just saying, they minimize risk to US personnel. They're actually very effective at identifying people and then killing them. And I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact of that they actually do identify terrorists or suspected terrorists and then remove them from the field of battle. And that has consequences too. But from a broader perspective, I think there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered about how these get used. The first is, from a strategic perspective, from a long-term perspective, is the threat posed by these targeted groups growing or shrinking? And we actually get an ambiguous picture looking at what officials say about this, looking at what we can actually measure happening from it. In some cases, it's better. In some cases, it's maybe not better, or it's staying the same. And I'm not really sure what that means yet, but it's something that I think needs to be brought more into the public discussion when we're trying to understand what effects these have. And then also over time, are the countries where we're employing this tactic, this weapon system, are they improving or staying stagnant or getting worse? In the case of a country like Pakistan, drones aren't the only cause of this, but they've been part of this broad movement towards anti-Americanism that's kind of sweeping the country. There's, just yesterday in The Atlantic, some professors that I respect greatly published their analysis of Pew survey data from 2010 and 2012 that actually offered an ambiguous picture of how drones are in kind of the Pakistani consciousness in broad public opinion. But American policy writ large in Pakistan is actually very unpopular, and drones are one of the most visible parts of that, even if the government is unwilling to acknowledge them. So regardless of the success they've had at identifying and destroying al-Qaeda inside Pakistan, these broader social and political consequences from using drones, and also from our counterterrorism posture in this region, have had effects, and we don't always know what they are. There's a great deal of guesswork and reading between the lines that has to happen, which kind of gets to the end part of this report, is looking at what we actually know from this. Do we know what the actual end state is? Jay Johnson, who used to be the Defense Department's counsel, has said, yes, we do see an end to this and a resumption of other activities. He didn't say when that was or what the conditions are that would bring it to us. So that's a question that we need to wrestle with. Whether the drones are being operated under the most appropriate or most effective national security legal authorities is another question that hasn't been definitively settled. In some places like Yemen, the Defense Department and the Central Intelligence Agency operate independent and potentially conflicting kill lists, and they pursue those kill lists independently. Occasionally they collaborate, occasionally they don't. We don't know if they work together. We don't know if they're actually going after the same people in different ways and engaging in destruction that they don't necessarily have to. Because of the secrecy of both drones, of the strikes, of the intelligence process behind them, of the decision-making process within the White House, all of these are incredibly difficult questions to answer, and I don't think we really can answer a lot of them definitively, at least from the perspective of, are they working and are they truly effective? And again, this report explains a lot of that. What I'm hoping that our two other speakers today can help us do is get at some of that context that I think is missing from the overall debate. Daphne Aviatar, I really hope I didn't butcher your last name, with Human Rights First, has written a great deal about the legal implications of the drone war, and she has her own remarks that I'm really looking forward to see, but she's presented a really key argument about how we actually relate these both to national security law and to international law, which is also a very important aspect of how the United States functions globally and how we relate to other countries. So I'm looking forward to that. Benjamin Wittes has also written, he runs the Lawfare blog, which is almost about this topic writ large. And he too writes a great deal about how we can think about drone strikes functioning, how they can be measured as effective, and also how we conceive of them as this tool of national security policy. I'm not going to belabor everyone with lengthy bios because I think that's kind of boring. But just thinking at it from this perspective of not necessarily trying to answer these questions, but just seeing if we're even asking the right questions is something that hasn't been done to any great extent in this debate. And I'm hoping that's what we can accomplish today. So without further ado, Benjamin, if you want to go ahead and present your perspective.
Thanks very much. I actually had a set of remarks that I was going to give, but in light of that introduction, I'm going to give a completely different one. I want to posit three things about drones and their use, and bring them together into a fourth, which will somewhat challenge the premise that we should be talking about drone use specifically as a sort of framework for the discussion. So let me try to bring this together. So the first thing is that a drone in and of itself is a weapon like any other weapon. It is very, very important not to confuse the platform and the weapon you mount on the platform. The platform is a flying robot that can do some degree of autonomous operation. The weapon is whatever you put on it. And that's one way of saying that if it's moral and legal and ethical to kill a particular person with a gun, it is moral and legal and ethical to kill the same person with a drone. It is very important not to confuse the weapon and the process of targeting. They are different. There's a great tendency with drones to do this because the weapon is exotic and it's standoff, and it's operated from Nevada, and it's really feels like something out of science fiction. It feels really different. But once upon a time, the spear was exotic because it was standoff, and it kept you safe and at a distance while you attacked. And in fact, when you focus on that aspect of drones, what you're actually doing is you're eliding the entire history of weaponry. It's not even part of it or some of it or most of it. It's all of it. All of it is a big process in trying to make your people more safe while you make the other guys less safe. And a drone, every issue that people focus on with respect to the drone in this regard is just as true as of the tactical tomahawk, which is, upwards of 25, 30 years old now. And so that's point number one. Point number two is that the drone has one really unusual feature. I wouldn't say unique, because it's not quite unique, but it is very unusual, which is that it is both a weapon and an intelligence collection platform. And that it therefore allows you to be dramatically more discriminating in the use of the weapon than you can from any other standoff aerial weapon. Now that is not to say it is the most discriminating weapon in the world. It isn't. And it's not to say that it's perfectly discriminating, which there's certainly a fair bit of data to show that discrimination has not been perfect. That said, so for example, given a particular target in an ungoverned space, a drone is a much, much more discriminating means of getting to that target on average than just about any other airstrike you're likely to do. It is less discriminating than putting your forces in harm's way on the ground in order to conduct an operation against that same target, where you really may be able to look and say you, but not you. You can do that with forces in play that you can't always do from the air. So when people talk about it as a highly discriminating weapon, that is correct, and that's a very important point. It is also a limited point. You have to say compared to what? And the implicit compared to, when people say this, is generally an airstrike or an artillery attack, but from some comparably standoff position. You can get much more discriminating if you want to get in close. So if we take as our backdrop these 2 points. This brings you to a third point, which is the question should not be, are you using drones? And what are the strategic implications of using drones? The question should be, what are the strategic implications of conducting military or covert operations, lethal covert operations in a given space using whatever technology is available? That, and the reason we are using drones for these operations is that the combination of the intelligence collection capacity of the platform and the lethality of the platform allows you to project force into areas in which you do not want to put large numbers of forces on the ground, or even small numbers of forces on the ground, for some combination of domestic political reasons, diplomatic repercussions with the countries in question, and force protection. And the question, so the drones for the first time allow you to contemplate a morally possible air campaign that is nonetheless specific enough to be effective. Now this does raise significant questions, but they are not fundamentally questions about technology, and they're not fundamentally questions about the use of drones. They're fundamentally questions about the exertion of power under those circumstances. Now I'm going to bring this together with one final point, and then I'm going to shut up. Why have we moved toward this style of warfare? And I want to posit 2 answers that are related but not, and overlapping but not quite the same, or maybe 3. So the first is that we have some recent experience with putting large numbers of forces on the ground, and it sucks. We don't like it, we don't want to do it, we don't have the domestic political appetite for invading large numbers of countries. And we have problems in large numbers of countries. And so the idea of projection of micro force, what's called in the administration the light footprint, right, is a very attractive strategic alternative to Iraq, to Afghanistan. It's inexpensive, it's targeted, yes, it does create enemies, but it creates many fewer enemies than invasions. Number 2, we have a fair bit of experience with the alternative to killing people, and it sucks. You capture people, and then we have people we've been litigating, having habeas cases for 10 years. Now I want to be very clear about what I am and I'm not saying here. I'm not saying we're doing drone strikes because we don't want to capture people. I am saying that if you have an environment in which the alternatives are all extremely hard, and they all beg very significant consequences, like having to have detention facilities at a fairly large scale, like having to put large numbers of forces in field, like bad litigation consequences, you do create incentives for relatively clean alternatives that are ironically, from a human rights point of view, less attractive. And then the other dimension that has given rise to this is that the enemy is not foolish, right? And the enemy has moved into spaces in which, and this is, I think, the principal reason, it knows we don't want to go in force. And there's a reason why we're fighting in places like Somalia, Mali, Yemen, Pakistan, tribal Pakistan, right? Which is that ungoverned spaces, the drone provides something of an answer to, a very imperfect answer to, the question of how do you go into those spaces and deprive people of that territory for the use and organization against you when you don't want to and don't have the political will to invade that territory and go in and force. All of this is a very long-winded way of saying that it is impossible to answer the question of the strategic, legal, and moral elements of drone use without reference to the question of what your alternatives are. And broadly speaking, the reason that we have fallen back on this strategy, and I'll stop here, is that there are two alternatives that people have posited, and they both stink. One of them is the application of a kind of criminal law model to areas of the world in which we in fact don't have the ability to project that sort of authority. And it doesn't, no one's actually figured out quite how to make it work. And the other is much larger scale projections of force, which we have neither the will nor the success ratio to justify at this point. And so I think the way to understand the projection of the use of drones and the use of this more broadly of special forces operations, these sort of micro-targeted projections of micro wars in these places, is as an effort to get some or most of the benefit of large-scale military action while without committing to it, and getting some or most of the benefit, the neutralization benefit of a robust law enforcement system without paralyzing yourself, because by and large we're talking about areas of the world in which the writs of our courts don't run and the writs of nobody else's courts run either.
Those were both great, very helpful introductions. I think, first of all, I just want to say, Joshua, your report I think is terrific, and I think you raise a lot of very good questions. I think the two things that struck me are, first, that we don't have enough information about the way drones are being used in this country, and I think that many of us across the political spectrum would agree with that. And that's one of, I think, the most important things to deciding how to move forward with the drone program and how to understand it, is to have more complete information about it. And Ben set out very well all the strategic advantages of it, why we want to use it, why the US government clearly intends to continue using it and is using it more and more aggressively. I think one thing, though, that you also said, Ben, is it highlights why drones are a little bit different. Because there's something about this technology that is so attractive, which is a bit different than a spear or other kinds of developments in the past, which is that we can do this all remotely. And that makes it much easier, in a way, to kill what we call bad guys, without really defining who the bad guys are, without thinking there won't be consequences for our troops and for Americans. And that, I think we're thinking that, but as Joshua, you point out in your paper, that's not necessarily true, because it depends on what the long-term impact of this kind of warfare is. But I think, so I'm going to talk a bit about the law, the legal perspective, and specifically the international law. And that's something that Human Rights First is focused on in this. And I brought our blueprint on that sets out what we think is relevant law and how we think the administration should be applying that law. Because international law, although it's often considered kind of soft and fuzzy, and Americans often don't think about it that much, it's extremely important, especially when you're talking about this kind of a new technology that is so attractive. It is so tempting to be able to kill the bad guys all the way over there and not have consequences to us. And that, we're not the only ones who have drone technology. Some 75 other countries have it. Most of them are not weaponized yet, but eventually they will be. And so it's extremely important that the rules that the United States follows are ones that we want others to follow as well, because it's not going to end with us. So the question is, who are we targeting with these drones, right? And I mean, Ben, you point out that is really the question, is should we be using military force in these areas? And in some areas, yes, it's perfectly fine to use military force. I guess there are two issues in terms of the question of international law. First of all, you have the law of armed conflict. So if we're talking about within the context of an armed conflict, of course we use military force, drones are an appropriate tool. You just have to make sure that you're targeting the people who either are members of enemy armed forces or civilians who are directly participating in hostilities or performing what's called a continuous combat function. So that's who's targetable legally within the context of an armed conflict. Now, outside of an armed conflict, it's more fuzzy. And this is, I think, where there's greater concern because it's not clear exactly where the U.S. is engaged in an armed conflict. So outside of an armed conflict, the law only allows you to target someone who really poses an imminent threat to human life. And there are these questions here with U.S. policy in terms of, first of all, where is the armed conflict? Who are we in an armed conflict with? For example, the U.S. government will say we're in an armed conflict with al-Qaeda and associated forces. So it's not specifically geographically based. It's these associated forces who are not named, right? And there are all these groups around the world that are now kind of al-Qaeda in something, right? Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic Maghreb. It's not clear what that means, and people who study al-Qaeda know that this is not a centrally organized group that functions as a fighting power around the world. And in order to have an armed conflict with a group, it has to be somewhat centrally organized, and you have to be in an armed conflict where the conflict is sustained and over a prolonged period of time. It's more than sporadic attacks. So I won't go off too much on the law of what defines an armed conflict, but it's important because when we're talking about the use of drones outside of an armed conflict, it has to be limited to an imminent threat. And there are a lot of concerns based on statements that the U.S. government has made, that U.S. officials have made, that perhaps we are, and it's not clear again because we don't have complete information about who we're killing, why, who's on the kill list, who's a target, but there are several statements that have been made that suggest we might be going beyond what the law allows. And a couple of those, one that's particularly concerning was from John Brennan, who said last spring that all members of al-Qaeda or associated forces are legally targetable with lethal force. That's an extremely broad statement. Members could be, the cook, the cleaner, could be a financier. It's not clear what a member of al-Qaeda and or its associated forces is. So that's an extremely broad interpretation and dangerous interpretation of international law. The other concern is, I think it was in the New York Times, was quoted that several senior officials have referred to the idea that if they find a military-age male in a strike zone, they're assumed to have been targetable. And if you talk to people in the military, the idea of a military-age male, MAMs, they call them, is sort of a long-standing concept. Again, that's not in compliance with international law. We can't target all military-age males because they happen to be in a place where we think there's some conflict going on. That doesn't make them a member of an opposing armed force, and it doesn't make them an imminent threat. So that raises concerns. And the administration has never responded to that statement. They've never said, no, we don't do that. They've never explained what that means. And finally, the idea of outside of an armed conflict, the government has said, various officials, I think Jay Johnson and Eric Holder have talked about, well, we're allowed to respond in self-defense to an imminent threat, but imminence is sort of flexible. And they've talked about a flexible or elongated concept of imminence, which, what does that mean? Imminent means there's an immediate threat, and the only way to stop it is with force. Flexible or elongated, it's not clear what that means. They've never defined it, and in some suggestions in some of the speeches that it means kind of when you can actually get access to this person that we think is a bad guy. So I won't go on about the law too much, but the point is that I think it's very important with this new technology for us to keep in mind, for the government to keep in mind, and to share more information about who is legally targetable, who can we be killing remotely around the world, because it is so tempting to see someone who looks like a bad guy, like he might be threatening U.S. forces, but we don't really know who he is or what he's doing. Let's just kill him. I'm not saying that that's what the American military members are doing, but I think that it is a very tempting thing to do remotely, and therefore the the laws that we operate under, the rules that we operate under are that much more important. And it's that much more important for the United States to explain publicly, both to the American people and to our allies, what rules it's operating under. Because it is setting this precedent, and our allies, especially in Europe, for example, take international law very seriously. And many of them have expressed a lot of displeasure with the way the U.S. has interpreted the law and the way the U.S. has conducted this program, and are actually refuse to share information in certain areas. For example, Germany has stopped sharing information about terrorism in parts of Pakistan because of their concerns about the drone program. So that's ultimately undermining the U.S. counterterrorism strategy. So I'll leave it at that, but I think this is a really important topic, and I think that between us we've covered a lot of the concerns.
Benjamin and Daphne, those are fabulous comments. I just wanted to dispel a quick myth about UAVs or drones, and that they say unmanned. But a statistic I heard a couple of weeks back was it takes 168 people to support what they call orbit. That'd be a drone up for 24/7, one drone up for 24 hours, 168 people. Or a comment that they're inexpensive. They cost millions, in many cases tens of millions. And then when you look at the infrastructure to support a drone, let's say flown from Nevada, there's satellite networks, they're all, I mean, these are pretty expensive systems. So I think there's a lot of talk out there that it doesn't, you just got your little model drone and one guy goes out there and he flies it around and takes pictures. It's never that simple, and it's not that cheap, and it can be rather labor intensive. So that's bringing something down to the tactical perspective here, but on drones. But it's certainly drones are not a panacea or answer to warfare as we currently know it. With that, let me open it up to questions. Remember my ground rules before. Just if you would raise a hand, I'll recognize you. You stand up, you speak loudly, give your name and your affiliation, and a short question, and hopefully we'll answer your questions. So, is anyone going to be bold enough to ask the first question, or are you going to force me to do that? I see a hand in the back. Yes, sir.
I'm Scott Shane from the New York Times, and I wanted to ask, you all undoubtedly noticed that John Brennan, in one of those speeches, said that he denied that the backlash against drone strikes that had been widely reported in Yemen was real, and so that they had intelligence or information that suggested that, in fact, most Yemenis actually support the strikes. I wondered if you had any insight into that dispute, and more broadly, how do we know we fly these things over and drop missiles, and then there's a debate over how people feel about it. But I wonder, that's sort of one of the missing pieces here is what, in terms of the strategy, whether, as Rumsfeld used to say, you're creating more terrorists than you're killing. And so I wonder how you can even get at that with a drone program.
I think Josh, I'm going to put this one on you first.
Okay, yeah, I used to work on Yemen for the Defense Intelligence Agency, so I'm a little familiar with what with what Brennan was talking about. I think what he was trying to say was that it's really hard to disaggregate general Yemeni discontent at their government and associated with that discontent at the United States from something specifically about drones. And there's some snippets of information here and there that people living in the areas most afflicted by AQAP and by Ansar al-Sharia actually do kind of tacitly accept the need to have drones assist the Yemeni military in getting rid of them. But the other side of that is, I think, kind of unavoidable, which is that when Yemenis, almost universally, when they talk to reporters, they express outrage and anger about the use of drones. When they speak to reporters, when they speak to Fulbright scholars, to PhD researchers who go to Yemen and talk about this, it's really consistent that there's opposition. All of these are different kind of self-selecting samples that I think make it difficult to draw really broad conclusions about it, both in the way Brennan has, but then also from the other side of it, people saying that there's universal opposition and it's all drones and that's what we need to focus on. I would question any kind of assertion that drones are popular, per se. But the question of whether people understand why they're used and the targets that they're generally targeted at. I think that that's more complex than a lot of the public kind of yo-yoing on it has really allowed for. I don't know if you guys have any perspectives on that.
So I don't claim any expertise in Yemen, particularly not when I'm sitting next to somebody who actually has some. But I do think this is a good illustration of the broader point that I was trying to make earlier, which is you have to ask the question with reference to what the alternative is. And you know, most people in most countries, and I would think Yemenis, I would probably instinctively include Yemenis in this, are not thrilled about foreign countries dropping bombs on their country. And if you do that from a drone, you're going to generate opposition to drone strikes, and understandably so. But if you do that from an F-16, and the consequence of using a drone is that you are more precise, more targeted, and you have fewer civilian casualties than you would have from the F-16, the marginal public opinion impact of that may actually be positive, even though it shows up, you know, positive with reference to the alternative, even though it's quite negative in an absolute sense. Now, I'm not saying that that's what's happening here, but I do think, you know, what your null hypothesis is a very important question when you assess the negative impact of drone strikes on public opinion and American attitudes. If the null hypothesis is that we do nothing and AQAP takes over the relevant territory, and we get blamed for having let that happen, that's a very different null hypothesis than if we use, less precise targeting, instruments that kill more civilians. And so I think with all of these questions, it's very important to say, compared to what?
If I could just add one point to that. I mean, I think that it is true to think about compared to what, but sometimes less can be more, and there are some situations where maybe the U.S. just shouldn't be using military force. Obviously, there's some where they should be, and I'm not saying anything talking about any particular strike in Yemen, but one alternative has to be that the United States government supports local forces, supports local law enforcement, supports local development, all the things that U.S. officials are talking about. There's a lot of things that we can do as counterterrorism strategy short of military force. And one of the options, one of the alternatives has to be maybe we don't use military force in that place if we're either targeting the wrong people or we're not sure who we're targeting, or if it's beyond the bounds of the law. Or if it potentially is going to have blowback and it's going to be strategically in the long run counterproductive. So that has to be one of the options, is maybe there are other ways of supporting local development, local law enforcement, and not necessarily bombing.
Let me add to this just a little bit. A lot of people miss the point that when we fly drones in Pakistan or Yemen, we do that with the permission of their government. We don't fly drones directly over Iran. I mean, maybe we do sometimes, but it gets shut down. People have said, how come we didn't have drones in Algeria or Mali? We don't have their permission to fly drones there. We have satellite coverage, of course, because look how high up it is. We don't need their permission for that. But we had another forum here on drones at ASP last August, and one of our panel members talked about the popularity of drones in Pakistan, the fact that she had visited a number of families that had a death that was associated with a drone. And of course, drones were rather unpopular with those families. So it's very hard to get aggregated data on what's popular, what's not popular. But I think if you go to a family that's had a family member killed from a drone, they don't like drones. So I didn't like that particular angle on the argument, but it's very, very hard to go out and figure out how effective they are we targeting the right people, and are they popular? So unless any of you all have anything to add to that specific. Another question? Yes, sir, over here.
Hi. Dixon Osborne with Human Rights First. Let's assume President Obama has been so impressed with what you've said today that you've been now named the new senior White House counterterrorism advisor, the new John Brennan. What is the first thing that you would ask the president to do related to the topic today?
Either of you want to take a stab at this?
I'll take a quick stab. I agree very much with Daphne that there is a lot the administration can and should say about the way it conducts what it does and doesn't do, and to the extent that the president can say more rather than less, more than they have said, and specifically address there's a specific set of issues that they have danced around and not addressed frontally that they should. And they've been relatively good, actually, about addressing the legal framework in which they conduct these operations, albeit at a fairly high level of generality. They have not done anything comparable in addressing what their targeting procedures look like, and even at a high level of generality. And Brennan has given a speech that basically says, as Daphne said earlier, that basically all members are targetable, but we don't target all members. And that's a really interesting statement, right? Because it implies that you have a whole set of criteria within the context of membership that you're actually using for your kind of granular judgments about this target but not this one. And I think to the extent that they could speak to that set of questions at a high level of altitude, you obviously can't talk about operational details, and I wouldn't want them to. But there are things that they could say, and they have begun erring on the side of saying more. There have been a whole series of speeches related to this subject, and I think that's healthy. I think they could do more than they've done. And then, in addition, and similarly, and Scott Shane has written about this a lot in the New York Times, and they need to figure out a way to talk about civilian casualties, and they need to figure out a way to count them in a fashion that has stable, meaningful definitions and stable numbers, even ranges that we can understand what they're saying. And that's a very, very hard project. I think I have spent some time over the last few months trying to think about what we could do in that department, and I've come to the conclusion that almost nothing is the answer, that there really is a huge underlying data deficit, and that's probably something that only the United States government can address. And I think if I were whispering in the ear of the president, I would say in the long term, what is going to make this technology available as a robust counterterrorism instrument is the perception, which I believe is correct, that for a lot of applications it's by far the most discriminating and human rights friendly way to approach kinetic military action, assuming you are engaging in it in the first place, right? And for people to believe that, they have to have a reason to believe that. And I think there's, I'm not calling for propaganda here, but I do think information, may be a long-term, in the long term, of great importance to establishing legitimacy here.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would advise doing is something that at least reportedly is already being done, which is finishing the playbook that essentially governs rules about how people are added to targeting lists, how they're either dealt with once they're on, or even removed should information come to light that exonerates someone from being included on that. There's a lot that Benjamin said that I would echo, in particular about really focusing on being transparent. One thing I would also suggest the president really prioritize is readdressing the detainee issue. As Benjamin said in his primary remarks, one of the reasons why drone strikes appear attractive is because capturing people and trying them in the United States is incredibly difficult from a political perspective, legally, even socially to an extent, if we're to gauge the public reaction to President Obama's first attempt to close down Guantanamo. there are a lot of hurdles that need to be jumped over that just haven't really been addressed at all, and that's kind of a glaring hole in the toolkit that we use to try to address these groups. And there's a huge amount that goes into that, and I think it would be actually kind of boring to start going through like the dissertation amount of information that would require. But looking at it, I think from that perspective of really trying to institutionalize the system, from the sense of putting in place controls, putting in place stable measures of inclusion, both for targeting and then ultimately for taking kinetic action, and then also unifying the system, understanding the complexity and annoyance of trying to discuss Title 10, Title 50 environments, the fact that there are two organizations operating under two different sections of US law, both doing the same thing, to me at least seems very problematic. And I don't know how to say if one is better or the other is better, but I think at least unifying both into a common set of intelligence, a common set of decision making, and ultimately a common set of assessment would really go a long way towards helping the government be more transparent and open about the effects of the program that it's engaging in.
If I could just add, I agree with what both of you have said, and just to be slightly more specific, or to add a couple of things, is I would specifically advise him to release the Office of Legal Counsel memos that have been written on the legal justification for the program, because I think the level of generality at which they've justified this program legally, it's been so vague that it's just allowed us to all raise lots more questions and to be confused. And so I think that would go a long way towards establishing more credibility. And I think also that just specifically the information, how they decide who is a bad guy, who they're going to kill, who is a civilian, how they make those definitions, and just releasing more numbers, more information, how many civilians are killed under those definitions, how many militants, or how, and making the playbook public, this playbook that we're talking about. It's fine if they have one, but we should know what's in it. So.
This brings a question to my mind, and Josh alluded to it, was the use of drones by the CIA versus the Department of Defense and the legalities of each. And some talk about the new CIA director being a little more explicit about it, or perhaps laying down some rules. But do either of you all have any thoughts or comments about that?
So the drone program is in the CIA because of an accident of history. The accident of history in question, at least as I understand it, and there may be people in the room who know this history better than I do, is that the armed predator happened to, the CIA had predators that they were using for intelligence gathering, and the idea, this sort of neat idea that you could stick a weapon on it, kind of developed in the agency, that's not actually in the long run a good reason to develop a whole new paramilitary organization. It's kind of credit to the agency that they sort of figured this out, and they figured out how to use it, and they figured out how to do all kinds of neat things with it. But at the end of the day, if the nuts and bolts of the operation of the thing is to kill people, that's really more the military's line of work than it is the CIA's line of work. The CIA, at the end of the day, is really an organization devoted to stealing secrets. And so there is a bit of mission creep. Now, there's an irony here that actually cuts in the other direction, which is that, and my colleague Bobby Chesney has actually has written a lot about this, but there's this perception that the military has much more oversight than the agency. But in terms of covert actions, when the military conducts covert action, they generally don't define them as covert actions for purposes of Title 50. They define them under, they have sort of different classification for a lot of sort of secret military activity, and that is not nearly as closely supervised by Congress as the, almost neurotic interchange between the intelligence committees and the agency over covert actions. And so the irony is that there's probably more oversight of the CIA's activity in this department than there is of, special operations forces in secret but not legally covert operations. And so I think there's actually a really sort of difficult policy problem in the long run, which is the stuff really belongs in the military and it should be migrated there. But you wouldn't want to do that in a way that lost the sort of oversight mechanisms that we have. And as I say, I'm talking a little bit beyond my lane here because this isn't something I've studied carefully myself. But my impression is that there is actually you'd have to be careful in that migration not to lose some degree of oversight that the program has.
Great answer, Sam.
C.M. Brown, I'm here at ASP as an adjunct. It seems to me that there are two sets of issues here that are being confused a little bit. One is the larger, very, very important set of grand strategy issues and just war issues. Under what circumstances is it appropriate? Is it in the national interest? Is it morally appropriate, and so on? Use lethal force against another country or against those who are located in another country. And the just war concepts, in a sense, cover or are reflected in a lot of the discussion that has been going on here, including targeting non-combatants, but also with respect to when you go to war, preventive war, preemptive war, imminence or not imminence. These are all questions that are very large, very important to discuss now. Then there's the drone question, which it appears to me is simply a tactical question, particularly because it is not like other weapons questions, like when you use nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons have tremendous impact for non-combatant fatalities and so on. The drone issues get into that a little bit, but it appears to me they're really tactical questions that the judgments are really military that have to be made with respect to when you use drones and when you don't use. The other set of questions are grand strategy questions we all have to be involved in as citizens of this country. But isn't there a little bit of a confusion of these two which maybe obscures what the real issues are?
I would agree, but I'm going to defer to Benjamin or Daphne on that.
I could answer that. I mean, I think that to some extent they're inseparable, and the reason I think that is because drones do allow us to engage in warfare in places we wouldn't otherwise. We're not going to send ground troops to Yemen or Somalia or places where we might be using drones. It's a strategy, it's a technology that allows us to use lethal force in places that we couldn't before without serious risk to our own side. And that makes more pressing the issue of, is it appropriate to use lethal force? Because it becomes very tempting to use lethal force in situations where we wouldn't have before. So I think you have to look at them together.
I agree with the premise of your question almost completely, which is the reason that I started by saying it's very important to understand that a drone is no different from any other weapon. The relevant question is whether you want to be engaged in this kind of warfare at all. That said, Daphne's caveat is very important. And if the nature of the weapon allows involvement that would otherwise not be thinkable, you do, as a result, develop a tendency to think about, say, drone warfare as a category of its own, rather than just thinking about, well, first you have a warfare question and a lethal force or resort to force question on whether you think about it under international law or as a just war question. And then you have a tactical question associated with what weapon you want to use. There is a sense with respect to robotics that you may be able to declare war against a person, and and actually think about warfare that way, right? And that does change the circumstances, or it can change the circumstances in which, for better or for worse. And I think Daphne would probably be more anxious about it than I would. I'm kind of enthusiastic about it, actually. But I do think whether you think it's a great thing or a lousy thing or a terrifying thing or a wonderful thing, it is a thing, and I do think it's a significant caveat to a point with which I otherwise agree.
We can take one more. Anybody with a dying question? Yes, sir.
I'm Morris Davis from Howard Law School. I'm just curious, what do you think the impact will be of the UN inquiry that's going to go on now with Ben Emerson looking at the legal justification for our targeted assassination program?
I think UN investigations are ones in which the United States tends to either make a show of cooperation and but it becomes more of a show than a reality, or doesn't even bother to make a show of cooperation. I can't imagine that if the United States government decides to release significant amounts of information, this would be the forum in which it would do it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I am also skeptical. I think it's a great idea. I've met Ben Emerson. He seems very serious about this, very objective about how he wants to go about it. And I hope the U.S. government will participate and will cooperate and give him the information he's looking for, but I don't know if they will. So that really all depends on how the U.S. cooperates.
I agree with all of that, and then also add that host government cooperation is really important as well. I mean, when we talk about this issue of civilian casualties, the fact that researchers are not permitted by Pakistan to visit affected areas is really important when we actually try to think about how we understand things that happen in these areas. If the UN is able to get access to the FATA and actually forensically examine strike sites, victims, interview people in detail without ISI minders nearby, honestly, more power to them, and I think we can all celebrate the amount of information that'll bring to light, because no one else has been able to do that. But I'm equally skeptical that anyone is really interested in playing along with this, because every single government involved in these, the United States, Yemen, Pakistan, now Somalia, maybe Mali, they all benefit from this system. And I think as long as there is that kind of like high-level political benefit to playing along in this, you're not going to get governments essentially wanting to undermine their own, what they see as their own effectiveness. And I mean, I don't see a way that the UN can get around that if it really wanted to, because it's not like it can force the CIA to suddenly open up its archives.
May I just add one thing to that? You know, there have been a couple of allusions to the posture of the Pakistani government, and you know, it's really important to understand in these discussions that there's a debate in the United States whether the executive branch is a unitary actor. There's no debate that the Pakistani government is not a unitary actor, and the question of whether we have the consent of the Pakistani government depends on which part of the Pakistani government is talking to whom and whether it's in public or not. And there may be parts of the Pakistani government that will cooperate with an investigation for certain parts, for certain aspects of the investigation, and in order to facilitate certain types of communications, but not others. And you know, that is a very important background problem in this entire conversation, is that you know, most drone strikes take place in Pakistan, most of the deaths are in Pakistan, and that government's posture in the conversation is extraordinarily complicated and shifting, and you know, volumes could be written about it.
Before I wrap this up, I want to point out a couple of things. First off, that's our hashtag right there. We have recorded this. We'll have it up on our website later this afternoon, if you so feel inclined. Please hit our website. We update it almost hourly. We put out a newsletter every week. We're blogging constantly, and now we're up to about 1,000 hits a day. So we think we're making an impact, and it's thanks to folks like you who look at our website. If you got something you want to advise us or tell us, please let us know. An administrative note, we have another event in here in about 45 minutes with part of my board, so we're going to have to clear this out rather quickly when I close this down, so I'd appreciate your cooperation there. Lastly, I think I have learned a great deal from the three of you today, and this issue is evolving, and we're all learning from it, and that's part of the purpose of ASP, is to expose us to the facts around matters just like this, and drones is a big one, and you've just been fabulous with your answers, so give them a big round of applause.